I want to take the time to thank everyone in here and everyone that has joined the Zoom as well. We have a great speaker today. His name is Dexter Van Zile. He's a research fellow for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. His work largely focuses on counteracting anti-Israel propaganda coming from and going into churches. He also has been instrumental in drawing attention to the lack of focus that some Christian peace activists place on the human rights abuses carried out in Muslim-majority countries. Mr. Van Zile has brought attention to many different Christian organizations that are antagonistic towards the Jews, such as the World Council of Churches, members of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, Sabeel, Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, and many more. Mr. Van Zile, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today about the Abraham Accords.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I want to thank everyone in the audience today and the people in the room at Bible Holiness Church, and also the people who are on Zoom. I also want to thank Reverends Daniel Taylor and Terry Miles for hosting me today. And I also want to thank Nathaniel Harris for organizing this event. One of the interesting things that I've had to keep learning again and again is that the value of the work that I do is largely dependent on other people. Of myself, I am nothing, so to speak. And if people don't act or help broadcast the information that I help collate with my colleagues here at camera, it has very little impact. And so that's really one of the reasons why I'm so very thankful for this talk today. I write lots of articles, and they don't mean a thing unless other people respond to them. And I'm going to open up with a brief story. A few years ago, I wrote a number of articles about an anti-Israel writer whose name I'm not going to reveal. And he was a very prominent evangelical Protestant. He had a lot of credibility. He'd written a number of books. And he was a professor at a prominent evangelical college somewhere in the Midwest. And this was about 2007. This was a long time ago. And I was a nobody when I first started writing about him, but I started to write dozens of articles about some of the misinformation that he broadcast about Israel to his readers. And for several years, it looked like he was immune to any of the consequences for the misinformation that he broadcast. I caught him broadcasting numerous undeniable factual misstatements and errors, and no one seemed to care. His publisher didn't seem to care. His readers didn't seem to care. Church leaders didn't seem to care. And officials at the school that he worked at didn't seem to care. And I became profoundly depressed. But unbeknownst to me, a lot of people started to actually read my articles. They didn't call me up and say, good job. They didn't say, we really appreciate the work that you've done. What they did was they went about the business of holding him accountable for the misstatements of fact that he broadcast. And they had weekly prayer walks around the building where the professor worked. And they prayed that somehow he would be removed from the faculty of the school where he was teaching. And I think the operative word, if you part of the expression was, is they wanted him driven from the school, which was pretty rough if you ask me. I was like, wow. And 10 years after I started writing about him, he resigned his post and went to another school. And the details are sketchy, but the people who know about the work of academia and the business of academia told me that it was reasonable to conclude that the misinformation that I had pointed out and that he had broadcast for many years finally caught up with him. And so that being said, if anything I say today is wrong, please call me first before you start any prayer works. If I look out the window and I see prayer people, walking in prayer around my building, I know I'm in trouble. And so give me a shout first before you do that, because I'm much more amenable to correction than some of the people that I write about. And my goal today is to talk to you about how the Abraham Accords and normalization treaties between Israel and a number of Arab countries in the Middle East should inform evangelical activism in the Holy Land in the Middle East in general. And my short answer is that pro-Israel evangelicals who have stood in solidarity with the Jewish people and their state for the past few decades, they're winning. You're on the right side of history. You're on the winning side. And what we are seeing is that leaders of some of the countries who have been the most inveterately hostile to Israel over the past few decades have concluded that it's in their interest to make peace with Israel. And in fact, they have concluded that it's more valuable for them to make peace with Israel than some of the people who run the so-called peacemaking organizations, the Christian peacemaking organizations that operate in the Holy Land. And so what has happened is that what we've seen is that we've seen Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East who are actually more pro-peace than so-called Christian peacemakers in the region. And that puts evangelical Protestants who support Israel in a pretty good position, because the challenge that you can offer is, why are you on the wrong side of history? Why are you helping not confronting the obstacles to peace in the Middle East by telling a story that blames Israel and only Israel for the continued existence of conflict in the Holy Land? And people in the region are starting to abandon the very resentments that so-called Christian peacemaking organizations have spent the past 2 decades or so stoking. And the challenge that you can offer is, why are you supporting the BDS campaign, which makes things worse between Israel and the Palestinians? What are you doing? And the reason why I think this is important is because, and I'm going to kind of diverge from the script, but American evangelicals have basically been set up as the other in American society. They've been set up as the people who are like bad. I don't really know how else to put it. I grew up in a denomination called the United Church of Christ. It was a Congregationalist church. And the church that, and it was a liberal or mainline Protestant church. The local church that I belonged to wasn't really that liberal, but for the most part, we were a mainline church. I think you know what mainline means. These were the people historically were essentially the people who called the shots, so to speak, the Protestant establishment. They weren't evangelical, so to speak, but they were part of the establishment. And I was a young boy, and I was riding on Route 1 north of Boston, and there was an Assembly of God church on Route 1. And I saw the sign and I said, "Oh, Ma, look at the Assembly of God church." And my mother understood that I had, and God forgive me, and I'm asking for forgiveness from people here in the room. I can see you on my screen. And she looked back while she was driving and she said, "They do good work." And she understood where I was coming from. And over the years of my work at camera, I realized just how much wiser she was than me. And that was really one of the things, is that what has happened is there's an anti-evangelical impulse in American society. And one of the things that people have portrayed American evangelicals as being this retrograde force, because they support Israel even as it oppresses the Palestinians. And I think that the Abraham Accords actually give American evangelicals an opportunity to turn the tables and say, really, who's the retrograde force in American society right now? Because we're not the ones who are singling Israel out. We're not the ones who are demonizing Israel. And we're not the ones hindering the prospects for peace in the region, even as Arab and Muslim leaders in the region are starting to abandon the notion that Israel is the source of all of the problems in the region. And that, I think, is a very, very powerful thing. So here are the broad outlines of what happened. In August of 2020, last year, the United Arab Emirates and Israel affirmed a normalization agreement that allowed for diplomatic relations between the two countries. And there had always been basically off the table relations between the two countries. They were able to talk on back channels for a long time. But finally, they said, we're going to go public with this. And then in September, Bahrain, another country, Arab country in the Middle East, followed suit with a similar agreement under the same rubric of the Abraham Accords. And in the following months, 2 other countries, Sudan and Morocco, also agreed to normalization agreements with Israel. And also a country outside the region, Bosnia, agreed to normal relations with Israel. And this is nothing short of miraculous. And this isn't to say that anti-Semitism is no longer a factor in the Middle East and the region has become a peaceful place. But what we're starting to see is that elites in a growing number of countries in the Middle East are starting to conclude that using Israel as a unifying scapegoat to maintain control of the societies they govern is no longer a winning strategy. And I think this is really one of the things that we have to understand about anti-Semitism is that oftentimes it's deployed as a tool of maintaining control. If the people in charge of the society are failing, aren't doing a particularly good job, one of the things that they can do is set up the Jewish people or Israel as a scapegoat. And that has been a tool of statecraft in the Middle East for a long, long time. And as most of you probably know, hostility towards Jews and Israel has been a prominent aspect of political and cultural life in the Middle East. And this animosity has its roots in Muslim teachings regarding the Jewish people. And you've been warned about the problems of replacement theology in the context of the Christian faith. And my colleague at Camera, Reverend Dr. Tricia Miller, who, by the way, is a credentialed pastor in the Assemblies of God. It's funny how things change. You know, God has a wonderful sense of humor. She's been one of the people that's helped me the most understand the most about the dangers of replacement theology. And it's the notion that the Church of Christianity has superseded or replaced the Jews in Israel for the purposes of God, and that the promises to the Jewish people no longer hold any value. And one of the underlying concerns that people have raised is that, look, if God can withdraw his promises to the Jews, then how can we rely upon his promises to us as Christians? This belief rendered Christians impotent in the face of violence against the Jews during the Holocaust in Europe, which is one of the reasons why most responsible theologians were opposed to this theology. And as it turns out, Islam has an even more robust belief that it has replaced the Jewish people, which is one of the reasons why Muslim majority countries in the Middle East and in the rest of the world have had such a terrible time accepting Israel's existence as a sovereign Jewish state. At the very best, Jews were not supposed to be sovereign, and neither were Christians. Christian sovereignty or Christian self-determination is also a very problematic thing. That was one of the things that the Armenian genocide, which took place in what is now modern-day Turkey between 1915 and 1918. And actually, there was a genocide of Christians that started in the 1890s and lasted until the early 1920s in what is now modern-day Turkey, largely because Islam wanted to replace Christianity. They said, yes, they were the people of the book, but whenever Christians advocated for their rights or equality or liberty in Muslim majority countries, under Muslim law, they set themselves up as legitimate targets for jihad. And that was essentially what happened during the Armenian genocide. And by the way, there was more than the Armenian genocide. There was also violence against Greek Christians in what is now modern day Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and also Assyrian Christians. And so essentially we were talking about maybe 2.5 million Christians being killed in what is now modern day Turkey under the Ottoman Empire and then the Young Turks. And the thing is that the same hostility that was directed at Christians has been directed at Jews, except that now the Jews have a state of their own. And they were supposed to be a subject people, otherwise known as dhimmis. And I don't want to get into too much of it, but I think you've heard the word dhimmi before. But basically, it's derived from the word dhimma, which is a treaty between Muslim rulers and Jews and Christians that live in their society, which say, you can be subservient people, you can live here, we're not going to kill you. But if you advocate for your rights, you are basically violating that treaty and you set yourself up as a target. And that's one of the reasons why Israel was such a shock to so many Muslims in the Middle East and the rest of the world. And it had a real world consequence on how Muslims interpreted their faith. Over the past decade or so, Arab countries in the Middle East started to recognize that there were bigger threats to their safety and well-being than Israel, most notably Iran. And so they realized that Israel could actually be a crucial ally in their efforts to prevent Iranian dominance in the Middle East. And this assessment was underscored last year when Iran made a number of attacks on oil installations and tankers in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And it was these attacks that prompted the UAE to accept a normalization agreement with Israel, because even there's another source of hostility within Islam between Sunni and Shia Muslims. And that is a long story that I simply don't have the time to get into. And there are other people who are much more expert in that conflict. But what happened is that the result of this was an affirmation of a text that read in part, we seek tolerance and respect for every person in order to make this world a place where all can enjoy a life of dignity and hope, no matter their race, faith, or ethnicity. Now, I don't want to emphasize or overemphasize it and say that everything is going to be peaches and cream in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East or even in the rest of the world, because the oppression of Christians is a terrible problem, even in the Middle East. The Bahrain and the UAE are much more tolerant of Christians than any of the other countries in the region. So it wasn't really hard for them to sign that type of agreement. But interestingly enough, the fact that these two countries have signed the agreement can be used to challenge Muslims in the rest of the world who have done terrible acts of violence against Christians and say, look, the UAE has done it, Bahrain has done it, other countries in the Middle East are starting to come around. Can you do this as well? And the Abraham Accords are starting to have what I would call a knock-on effect in other countries in the Middle East. In November, a prominent scholar in Saudi Arabia declared that, according to some Islamic sources, the farthest mosque, or Al-Aqsa Mosque, might not be in Jerusalem, but is instead located in Mecca. One of the sources of hostility towards Israel is that it controls Jerusalem and it controls the Temple Mount. And on this mount is called Al-Aqsa Mosque. And at one point, there was supposed to be a night during which I think it's called a night of power, that Muhammad, according to the Islamic faith, actually visited this mosque with the help of God. And essentially, that's been a source. They say that's our territory. This should be part of our patrimony, and the Jews should not be able to control that territory. And Israel has done what it can to respect the rights of Muslims on the Temple Mount, and is actually arrested its own Jewish citizens who prayed on the Temple Mount. If anybody has been oppressed in the Temple Mount, it's actually Jews. But the thing is that with a Muslim scholar from Saudi Arabia saying maybe it's not Jerusalem that we need to worry about, maybe we can basically admit that that's not the farthest mosque. What they're trying to do is to reduce the source of tension between Muslims and Israel in the Middle East. And if that happens, people could get on with their lives, no longer worrying about whether or not Jews are praying on the Temple Mount. And so, and that is, I think, a very important thing. And so implicit in this line of thinking is that dutiful Muslims no longer have to insist on conflict with Israel or Jews as part of their faith. And so maybe after decades of fruitless struggle against Israel, a growing number of leaders might actually have the ability to update the worldview of the countries they govern. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen overnight, and I don't want to exaggerate the impact, but I am much more hopeful about this than I was a long time ago. Unfortunately, one group that hasn't really gotten the message are Christian peacemakers. And also the Palestinians themselves. The Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have portrayed this as an act of betrayal. The Abraham Accords, you betrayed us. And the Deputy Minister of Religious Affairs for the Palestinian Authority declared normalization with a Zionist entity is high treason against Palestine, Jerusalem, the blood of the martyrs, and the suffering of the prisoners. And when they talk about the prisoners, they're talking about Palestinians who perpetrated terror attacks against Israelis and whose families are essentially being paid a salary by the Palestinian Authority because of that. And the thing is that you would think that the Christian peacemakers, particularly here in the United States or in the ecumenical community, such as the World Council of Churches, would say hallelujah to the Abraham Accords, but they haven't really, because they have kind of accepted the same line put forth by the Palestinians. And just recently, and I think I want to cut it short because I don't want to keep you silent for so long. I want to hear some of your questions. But just recently, the World Council of Churches, there was a member of the WCC that was on a conference call, and he said some terrible things about Israel that, he said that people are going to look for the blood of the Palestinians from the people who supported Israel over the years. And he has said that, and he was from South Africa, and he said, look, the demons that we dealt with in South Africa are not as bad as the demons that the Palestinians have had to deal with. And the demons that have assailed the Palestinians have been able to invite other demons in from Europe to help them out, or from the West. And that's a very problematic language. And so when I've written about that, one of the things that I mentioned in offhand is that, by the way, the World Council of Churches didn't support or supported boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And they said, no, we've never done that. We've never supported BDS. We're not part of the BDS movement. When in fact, they were one of the central elements of it. The World Council of Churches had founded the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum, which basically wrote a document back in 2009 that promoted BDS. And then they send volunteers, the World Council of Churches sends volunteers called Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, part of the EAPPI, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine, Israel. And they go there and they bring cameras and they document everything the Israelis do wrong. And frankly, sometimes the Israelis do things wrong because they're human beings, and there's no way that you can put an army into the field and have them behave perfectly. That's just not how things work. People can be sovereign or it can be innocent, but it can't be both at the same time. And the thing is that when the Palestinians do bad things, these volunteers from the World Council of Churches, they just conveniently put their cameras away. And so they don't talk about a huge number of problems. They've even assisted in the effort to demonize Israel by dishonestly portraying the Israelis as withholding vaccines from the Palestinians, even for the COVID-19 crisis, even as the Palestinians themselves have said, bragged about how they were able to get vaccines from Russia. Peacemakers, Christian peacemakers that I deal with, they don't talk about the salaries being paid to terrorists by the Palestinian Authority. They don't talk about how Palestinian leaders praise Palestinian terrorists who kill Israelis. Some of this praise has come from Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas himself and other high-ranking officials. And they don't even talk about passages in the Palestinian Authority that declares Sharia law as a source of legislation for areas under control of the PA. And Sharia law, what it does is that it enshrines Islam as a dominant force over Jews and Muslims. Jews and Christians, excuse me. So what I think is going on is that this opens up an opportunity for people here in this room to ask the Christian peacemakers, isn't it time you help the Palestinians move on like the people in the rest of the region has? And so I think that's really what's going on. And with that, what I'll do is I will close the talk and open it up for questions. So who wants to run the question and Q&A right now?
That's Dexter.
Yes. Thank you so much. Now, is Nathaniel going to hop up to the podium to run the Q&A, I think? I can't hear anybody. It's like a Black Mirror episode right now.
Can you hear me, Dexter?
Yeah, now I can. Excellent.
Strange. I did have When you were speaking, you were talking about how we can turn the tables and start asking those questions of who's really helping in the Middle East, who is really the ones that are trying to move forward and progress. And can you just kind of point out some of these organizations that you've dealt with that have come at it from the angle of the Palestinians can do no wrong? Well, Israel is the aggressor. And
right. But yeah, what I should probably give people a map of essentially what's going on. And I'm going to talk about the World Council of Churches because this helps explain a lot. The World Council of Churches was founded in 1948 after World War II, and it was founded the same year that Israel was established. And it was founded largely to help people dealing with the terrible crisis. World War II destroyed Europe, okay? And it also kind of put the world in disarray. And for a few years after the World Council of Churches was founded, Russia, the Soviet Union, regarded the World Council of Churches as essentially a spy organization for the United States government. And they didn't want to work with the organization. And then what did they do? They hijacked it. The Russian Orthodox Church that was operating behind the lines, so to speak, in the Russian or the Soviet bloc, behind the Iron Curtain, they started to influence the World Council of Churches and said, look, if you condemn the Soviet Union and you speak too much about the abuse of human rights in the Iron Curtain, we're not going to be able to participate with the World Council of Churches. And so what did they do? They zipped their lips. They said, okay, we won't say anything. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, it was a brief protest. But then the organization went silent. And at the same time, it condemned the United States for its foreign policy in Latin America, particularly in Nicaragua. And if you look at the meeting minutes for the 1983 World Council of Churches, they lambasted the United States and condemned the United States for what we were doing in Latin America. And then on the very same page, somebody from the Russian Orthodox Church said, but we really don't want, on another resolution, they said, we shouldn't talk too much about Afghanistan because it's just going to be used to score propaganda points against Russia. The very same argument could have been used in the previous resolution, but it wasn't. So one of the things that we need to understand about the World Council of Churches is that it's essentially an enemy to free people and a friend to authoritarians. The same process has exhibited itself in the Middle East because there are significant numbers of Christians living in these Muslim majority countries. And one way that they can demonstrate the value to the governments under which they are living historically, particularly like in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia and in the West Bank, is to demonize Israel. And in some instances, these Christians have actually used anti-Semitic or anti-Judaic passages that other Christians have abandoned to demonize Israel. And that's one of the reasons why the World Council of Churches has been so hostile to Israel, and why a lot of other Christian communities, is because a small group of Palestinian Christians has been able to reach out to their friends and allies in Western churches and say it's all Israel's fault because they are the more powerful party to this conflict. And the thing is that because the Palestinian Christians are a beleaguered people, people don't really want to have to fight too directly with them because they feel kind of guilty to point out the things that they're saying aren't necessarily true because they live in some pretty tough circumstances. And they will say everything is wonderful between us and the Muslim majority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then every once in a while, events happen and they can't really speak about it. Churches will get burned. Women and girls will be forcibly converted to Islam. And so this is the problem. So that's one of the reasons why they don't want to speak honestly about what's happening with Israel, because it's safer to beat up on Israel than it is to condemn Muslim leaders. And one of the things that I want to put on your radar, and it's not directly related to Israel, is pay very close attention to what ecumenical leaders are saying about China. If you go to the World Council of Churches website and plug in the word Uyghur, who they are a people in China that's being subjected to nothing short of a genocide, you will not find any entry whatsoever about the Uyghurs. But you will find hundreds, literally hundreds of entries about how evil Israel is. So people don't want to talk about China, but they will go left, right, and center all the time about Israel. So that may be an issue, and I'm looking. The people in the room that I see, you can do something about that. And I would ask you to pay very close attention to the World Evangelical Alliance, which is, not as bad as the WCC, and see what they say about Israel. And they're much better. Have them look at what they say about China. And that would be a very interesting thing. So that's, I think, a good. So the reason why they don't want to talk about Palestinian misdeeds is because in some instances it will put Christians who live there in trouble. So are there other questions? I see one on our Q&A that says, will the new administration's decision to take military action against Syria have an impact on the US's ability to broker future good peace deals in the Middle East? And I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question. In large part because right now the Arabs are worried about Turkey and Iran. And historically, what the United States has done is essentially try to manage conflicts. When the Soviet Union became a threat to the region, we worked with Turkey and Saudi Arabia to keep them out. And we did what we could to keep, and we also worked with Iran. When Iran became a problem, we worked with other leaders in the region to basically counter Iran. So I don't think we're going to be able to bring up or achieve any permanent peace in the region that the leaders themselves don't want. But I think what we can do is hopefully kind of play a balancing act so that they don't erupt in a world war similar to what happened in Europe. And it's easy for, just one last thing about that, it's easy for us in the West to kind of like look down on people in the Middle East and say, look, they're all just, they're all at each other's throats. But if you look at what happened in the 20th century in Europe, there were 2 world wars that killed millions and millions of people, in large part because of the same balance of power difficulties that exist in the Middle East. So if we can help shepherd the region, so to speak, into a more enlightened time without any huge wars, that will be a great blessing. And right now, I think Iran is the biggest threat. So, and the next question that I see is, what impact will a new American administration have on the Abraham Accords? Now, one of the things that I want to say is that CAMRA is a nonpartisan organization, and we can't get too involved in politics or in particular policy debates. And I think, though, I think that the Abraham Accords, that's a train that I don't think people are going to be able to stop. I think that the people in the region regard Iran as such a huge threat that they are never going to go back to demonizing Israel. I could be wrong, but I think people in the region now are worried about their material self-interest. And they're not thinking in symbolic terms about the Jews anymore. They're thinking about, what do we need to do in order to provide for our children and our families, and what can we do to keep ourselves safe? And does Israel represent a threat to our safety? No. But 2 decades ago, it might have been an insult to our dignity, but right now, the honorable thing to do is to make peace with Israel. So I think that is going to happen. I think we're going to see more Abraham accord-like agreements between Israel and other countries in the region. So, do we got any other questions?
Yes, we do.
Yes, regarding just kind of what you just said leads into my question because of the economic and strategic situation, basically with Iran. Do you see countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, maybe Kuwait joining the Abraham?
I couldn't hear it exactly, but so I think I think that economic well-being and peace is becoming an increasingly valuable commodity to people in the region. And I don't want to exaggerate, okay, because there are extremists that do seem to capitalize on hostility and instability, and we see that here in the United States as well. And one of the just as and during times of economic crisis, if things go south, if there's like a global depression, we're going to have a problem. I don't think that there's going to be any way around that. But one of the reasons why churches like yours are so important, and I just recently wrote a book chapter, is one of the biggest problems in Germany prior to World War II, prior to the Holocaust, was that there was a huge number of humiliated young men who came back from the war, from World War I, and there was really no one there to minister to them. And they had Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and there was a lot of intellectuals that could tell people what needed to be done, and they could summon people to Christ. But there weren't really very many pastors that could actually show them the way. And that's one of the reasons why I am very thankful for a robust evangelical movement here in the United States, because there's a huge number of young men in the United States. We saw them, we see them in cities who rioted this past summer. We see people who need the gospel. And if your church doesn't get to them, somebody else is going to. And that's the frightening thing. And this will be the time, and if you can get to them during a time of crisis and shepherd this country and its young men and women through this crisis, I think the American people will be profoundly thankful for decades to come. You'll be the establishment. So, any other questions?
Yes. You see how we can go over there and minister. Is there anything else that we as Christians in the U.S. Can do to help further peace in the Middle East?
Well, one of the things is to advocate for Christians in beleaguered environments throughout the world. And what that will do is put pressure on leaders in the region to change their civil society to the best that they can. In Egypt, the Egyptian government has put pressure on its imams and saying, you are going to stop preaching hate the way you used to. And that will be a good thing for peace in the region. And so I think that's really a very important thing. So, and you can do it. I have enormous faith in the people there in this room. I know you can do it. It's scary, it's frightening. These are the roughest times. I don't know, it's not as bad down where you are, but this lockdown has driven people crazy up in Massachusetts. And I told my daughters, I said, if you can maintain forward motion during this time as best you can, you're going to be okay when you get on the other side of this. And so I just beg you to do everything you can in your church life to maintain as much forward motion as you can. If I could put my hand through the camera and put my hand on your shoulder and just beg you, I would, but I can't. So. I'll close with a story if you want, and then we'll close. I don't want to keep everybody. Oh, yeah.
We have one more question.
Okay.
They're wanting to know, aside from camera, this camera is a really great source. What are some other sources that we can go to to get more information, sources that we can get plugged in. Camera is a great one.
Right. Well, I think, yeah, first of all, just a word about camera. The Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, we've been working since the 1980s to provide, to counter misinformation. And CAMERA has actually started CAMERA's partnership of Christians and Jews, which essentially is to counter the anti-Israel misinformation and frankly, the anti-Western misinformation that's come out of some of the media, particularly in the Middle East. And also, I think that there are some books you might, Gerald McDermott, who's a very good writer, he wrote a book called Israel Matters. And also, there are a lot of actually pro-Israel Christian organizations that, like the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem provides good information. And also, and I would remind people again of Gerald McDermott's book. And also my colleague Tricia Miller has written a book about the book of Esther. And the name eludes me, but go to Amazon and look at Google or search for Tricia Miller and find her books. Because you need to rely on books because the media is completely unreliable. This is a rough time for a lot of people, and I'll end with this, and I don't want to keep you too long. A long time ago, I worked in a fishing boat in Southeast Alaska, and at one point we were fishing. It was a salmon boat, and it's a big net, and it's a lot of work. And we set the net out several times. We started at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we set the net out from 6 a.m. to 3:30 in the afternoon, 5 or 6 times, and all of the other boats weren't even bothering to fish. And we were screaming at our skipper saying, why are you doing that? Why are we doing this? Why are we working so hard? And then what happened was that 3:30 in the afternoon, we set the net out. And we had a problem. The problem was not that there weren't any fish. The problem was that net was filled with fish. And we were going to sink the boat if we tried to haul the net on board all at once. And literally, you would have been able to see the bottom of the boat. And that's how I hope it is for your church. That's really how I hope it is. I want you to just keep plugging away. And then all of a sudden, the tide is going to turn, because that's what happened. The salmon showed up when the tide turned. And people are going to come looking for people who can provide them with a sense of order and help usher in the Spirit of Christ into their world. I can say that as a Christian, and into their lives. And, it's a rough time right now. It may not be as rough in Missouri as it is in Massachusetts, but things may get rough, but the tide's going to turn. And with that, I'll stop talking. Nathaniel, you want to end it? All right. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dexter. That was really great. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I hope everyone here, thank you for coming, thank you for listening and being engaged. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.